I knew they were going to kill her the night the council met. I just didn't know how. The village had always been quiet, nestled between hills and forests, far away from the noise of the city. People didn't leave. That was the rule. You stayed, you married, and you served your family. That's how it had been for as long as anyone could remember. No one questioned it. No one thought it could ever be different. Except for Kemi. Kemi was the kind of person who wasn't afraid of anything. Even when we were kids, she would do things that made the rest of us scared. She would climb the tallest trees, swim in the deepest part of the river, and argue with the elders when they told her she was too bold for a girl. But no one expected what happened later, not even me. My name is Toby. I've lived in this village my whole life. I'm a simple man, just a farmer, doing what I've always done. I don't like trouble, and I've always kept to myself. But what happened with Kemi, what they did to her, that changed everything. I can't forget it, no matter how hard I try. I grew up with Kemi. We were neighbors, and we used to walk to school together, back when there was still a school in the village. It wasn't much, just a few rooms, and a teacher who came once a week. But Kemi loved it. She was always the first one there, sitting at the front of the class, her eyes bright with excitement. She would ask questions more than anyone else. The teacher liked her. Said she was smart, too smart for this village. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was happy enough working in the fields with my father, learning how to plant crops and tend to the animals. That was my future, and I accepted it. But Kemi, she wanted more. She wanted to see the world beyond the village. She talked about leaving, going to the city to study, to become something bigger than what the village could offer. Most of us just laughed. We thought it was silly, a young girl with big dreams. But she wasn't joking. One day, when we were about 16, Kemi got a letter. It was from a school in the city. She had applied, and they had accepted her. She was going to leave the village, just like she'd always said. The news spread fast. People were shocked. The elders were furious. A girl leaving the village like that, it was unheard of. Girls were supposed to stay, get married, and serve their families. That was their duty. But Kemi didn't care. She packed her things and left without looking back. Her family tried to stop her. Her father, a quiet man who rarely spoke, begged her to stay. Her mother cried for days. But Kemi was determined. She said she would come back one day, and when she did, she would prove to everyone that a woman could be more than just a wife and a mother. And she did come back. But not the way anyone expected. It was 3 years later when Kemi returned to the village. I remember the day clearly. The sky was overcast, and there was a strange stillness in the air, like the village was holding its breath. Kemi walked into the village square, her head held high, carrying books in her hands and wearing clothes we had never seen before. She looked different, older, stronger. Her hair was braided tight, and she wore glasses, something no one in the village had ever needed. The women in the market stared at her, whispering behind their hands. The men stopped what they were doing, watching her with suspicion. It wasn't just the way she looked, it was the way she walked, with confidence, like she didn't care what anyone thought. I went to greet her, but before I could reach her, the elders appeared. They had heard she was back, and they weren't happy. Baba, the head of the council, was the first to speak. "You should not have returned, Kemi," he said, his voice low and angry. "You have forgotten who you are." Kemi didn't flinch. "I haven't forgotten anything," she said. "I came back to share what I've learned." Baba shook his head. "You've been poisoned by the city. You're no longer one of us." Kemi looked around at the people gathered in the square. "I haven't been poisoned," she said, her voice loud and clear. "I've been educated. I've learned things that can help this village." Things that can make life better for everyone. The crowd murmured, uncertain. Some of the younger women looked interested, curious. But the elders were not impressed. A woman's place is here, Barbara said, his voice rising. With her family. Serving her husband. Kemi smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind of smile that made you uneasy, like she knew something we didn't. That's what you've been told, she said. But it's not the only way. The elders didn't like that. They saw her as a threat, a challenge to their authority. But they couldn't do anything, not yet. So they told her to leave the square and go back to her family's house. They would deal with her later. I watched her walk away, and I knew then that things were going to change. The village wasn't ready for someone like Kemi. And the elders, they wouldn't let her stay. Over the next few weeks, Kemi started talking to the women in the village. She told them about the city, about the things she had learned. She told them that they didn't have to marry at an early age if they didn't want to, and that they could study, work, and be independent. Some of the younger women were excited by her ideas. They started asking questions, thinking about what their lives could be like if they had more choices. But the elders didn't like it. They saw Kemi's influence growing, and they knew they had to do something to stop her. The men in the village were uneasy too. They didn't like the way their wives and daughters were listening to Kemi, the way they were starting to question things that had never been questioned before. One night, the council called a meeting. It was held in the village square, around the fire. Only the men were allowed to attend. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I couldn't stay away. I knew they were going to talk about Kemi, and I needed to know what they were planning. I hid behind one of the huts, close enough to hear their voices. Barbara was speaking. Kemi has brought chaos to our village, he said. She is poisoning the minds of our women, filling them with ideas that have no place here. The other elders nodded in agreement. One of the younger men, Femi, spoke up. She's dangerous, he said. If we don't stop her, she'll destroy everything. Barbara's voice was grim. We cannot allow her to continue. For the good of the village, we must silence her. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were talking about killing her. The elders, the men who had always taught us about honor and respect, were planning to take her life because she was different, because she was a threat to their power. I wanted to run, to warn Kemi, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, terrified of what would happen if they found out I had heard them. The meeting ended, and the men left the square, their faces set with grim determination. I stayed hidden, my mind racing. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. The next day, Kemi wasn't at the market. People whispered, but no one said anything outright. It was like everyone knew something was going to happen, but they didn't want to admit it. The tension in the village was thick, like a storm waiting to break. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the council meeting, about the things they had said. I knew they were going to make their move soon, and I was afraid. Just before dawn, I heard a noise outside my window. I got up quietly and looked out. In the dim light, I saw a group of men walking towards Kemi's house. Barbara was leading them. My stomach twisted in fear. I knew what they were going to do. I ran out of my house and through the back alleys, trying to stay out of sight. When I reached Kemi's house, I hid behind a tree, watching as the men approached her door. They knocked, and after a moment, Kemi opened the door. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept in days. When she saw the men, her face hardened. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady. Barbara stepped forward. "You defied the council, Kemi. You've disrespected our customs and our way of life. For the good of the village, we can't let you continue." Kemi crossed her arms, glaring at them. "I haven't done anything wrong. I've only tried to help." Baba shook his head. Your help is not wanted here. Without another word, the men grabbed her. She fought, kicking and screaming, but there were too many of them. They dragged her into the forest, and I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. They took her to a clearing, far from the village. The moonlight cast long shadows on the ground, and the air was thick with tension. I watched from the trees, too scared to move, too scared to do anything. They tied her to a tree, her face bruised and bloodied from the struggle. Baba stood in front of her, his face expressionless. For the good of the village, he said quietly. Then one of the men stepped forward with a knife. I turned away, unable to watch. Kemi was gone, and the village pretended like nothing had happened. Her family was told she had left again, back to the city. But I knew the truth. I knew she was buried somewhere in the forest, her dreams silenced forever. The women stopped talking about leaving. The village went back to the way it had always been, as if nothing had ever changed. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't stop thinking about Kemi, about how she had wanted something more, something better. And how they had taken it from her. I kept the secret for years, afraid of what would happen if I told anyone. But now, the world outside our village is changing. People are talking about things that Kemi talked about: rights, education, freedom. Her ideas didn't die with her. They're still here, growing quietly, waiting for the right time to bloom. I don't know what will happen when that time comes, but I hope the village is ready. Because Kemi's fight isn't over. Even if they silenced her, the seeds she planted are still here. And one day, they'll grow into something the village can't ignore.